What's going on? What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the Justin Henry Show. Today, we are going over to the Houston Texans and previewing their players for fantasy. If you're here for the first time, do not make it the last time. We're going over all 32 teams in the NFL, talking about fantasy value for each player and each team. So make sure to subscribe, drop a like on this video as we get into the Houston Texans preview for fantasy football. When it comes to the Houston Texans, they caught a lot of people by storm last year, and this is a team that exceeded expectations in many ways. They had the Rookie of the Year, Offensive Rookie of the Year, had a lot of awards that they won. This Houston Texans team went deep in the playoffs as well, but for fantasy purposes, gave us some real good value, especially later in your drafts, out of some undrafted players or players who were even taken really late in drafts. So overall, a very nice season for the Houston Texans when it comes to fantasy football. The start of that is CJ Stroud. And CJ Stroud had a phenomenal season. Like I mentioned, he was the Rookie of the Year. But that's where it all began. In this offseason, they added another weapon in Stefon Diggs for this Houston Texans team. So I want to talk about what all this means. Traded for a running back as well. Like, this is, there's a lot of elements when it comes to this Houston Texans team and what this is going to look like moving forward. So when it comes to CJ Stroud, last year, he caught us all by surprise. He was the number 2 overall draft pick, but nobody expected him to play the way he did. You were getting him at like the back end of your draft, right? And when it comes to CJ Stroud, it's like, you got really good value on him because you either got him for free later, either after the draft or maybe partially through the season. But he performed at a crazy high level all season long. He finishes the QB 11 in only 15 games, which to me indicates, he's going to have a nice career. And he was the number 2 pick. A lot of people were, expecting him to be the number 1 pick in the draft. It ended up being Bryce Young. CJ Stroud was the number 2 and played much better than Bryce Young did. And on a points per game basis, he was the QB 10 too. So it's not like, it's not like it was the amount of games he played. It's just, dude's a baller. 4,100 yards, 23 touchdowns, only 5 interceptions. And, the one thing I'll say about this is I think where the Texans caught a lot of people off guard last year, they're on notice now. People know to expect the Houston Texans and CJ Stroud specifically to play well. And, he only had 2 games last year over 22 fantasy points. Now, I know the receiving core has been upgraded. I know the running game has been upgraded. But I think in real life, this Houston Texans team plays really good defense, and they're not going to have to throw as much as they did last season. Last year, CJ Stroud was throwing between 40, 45 times a game. And I think with the talent level on this team, they may not be in as many shootouts as they were last year. The defense is improving. So when it comes to CJ Stroud this year, I would kind of expect a lot of the same. And I think you're going to have to overpay right now for what CJ Stroud's value is. Currently, his ADP is like QB5, QB6, QB7, depending on where you're looking. And like I mentioned, he was quarterback number 10 on a per-game basis last year. I know the weapons have increased, but sometimes when you are able to score a little easier or play a little bit more efficiently, the offensive fantasy numbers come down because he's also not going to give us a whole lot in the ground game. So while I love CJ Stroud as the player, I think he is a phenomenal player and has many more years to come of not just fantasy relevance, but real life, great football future in store for CJ Stroud. I think he's a little overvalued fantasy-wise. Ain't that crazy to say? I mean, we see the sports cards and stuff go crazy, but for fantasy, it's like, man, you got to draft CJ Stroud ahead of a lot of other notable quarterbacks. And he played well last year, but it wasn't like he was 5,000 yards. I think he just caught a lot of us off guard. So CJ Stroud, I think he'll be a good safe player. Like, don't get it twisted. If you draft CJ Stroud, I think you know what you're getting. You're getting a phenomenal player with upside. How much is that upside in this offense and with the way that team is going to be playing this year? So that's my caution. My caution is I think if you draft CJ Stroud, just know you're probably overpaying. There's ceiling there. It could happen, but you're probably overpaying. One of the pieces that they brought in this offseason was Joe Mixon. And Joe Mixon has been a fantasy value over the last few years, right? With the Bengals, Joe Mixon, he'd often slide down to RB2 territory. A lot of people would be tired of drafting Joe Mixon, always looking for the next running back. But he's been a top 13 back or better 5 out of the last 6 seasons. So last year he finishes the RB6 and had 1,000 yards rushing, 9 touchdowns. 52 catches, 376 receiving yards. He had 3 touchdowns in the air. Like this, Joe Mixon, bro, he's a staple. And now he goes to a really nice offense with the Houston Texans. I don't see why he's still not a top 10 to 12 back locked in. And you've seen the way Dameon Pierce, Devin Singletary at times played last year. There's room for this team to have a strong running back. Like they needed somebody to come in and be the dominator, right? To be used in the red zone, to be able to catch the ball at the backfield. They were trying to use both Singletary and Pierce like complementary backs. Joe Mixon can do it all. He don't really need another back. So I think Joe Mixon's in for a hell of a season. He just got a 3-year deal, so it's not like he's going anywhere anytime soon. This offense can move with or without him, and I think he's going to see the beneficiary of. He's going to be a big beneficiary of that. So I like what Joe Mixon brings to the table. I think he'll continue to be a value in drafts, especially if he's going outside of the top 10 while everybody's searching for the new names and new players. This is a guy who's been a staple of consistency over the time in the league. So give me Joe Mixon. I like the value on him this year. Let's see how things play out over the offseason when it comes to ADP. But Joe Mixon, I think he'll be a value in drafts this year. Next up, Dameon Pierce. I don't really want to talk a whole lot about Dameon Pierce. He had a down season, and this is a brand new offense for him. He struggled. He played 14 games, struggled. He was dealing with injury, only had 400 yards rushing. I know a lot of people were optimistic about Dameon Pierce, but I think he's only impactful if there's an injury. Like he doesn't offer much in the receiving game, only 100 yards receiving last year. I think Dameon Pierce's time is probably going to – I mean, he's a backup. So will there be a time where he maybe can get some extra carries? Yes. But I think his fantasy relevant time, dynasty-wise, like I'd be looking to move this guy if I could. It's just this is Joe Mixon's backfield now for the foreseeable future. Dameon Pierce is locked into a backup role at best. So although a lot of people like Dameon Pierce coming out, he had a strong start to his rookie year. This is where things start to fizzle out, unfortunately, for Dameon Pierce. Next up, let's talk the receiving game. And Nico Collins, he played incredible last year. Finished as the wide receiver 12. He was the wide receiver 7 on a points per game basis. Like, bro, Nico Collins looked like an elite wide receiver at times production-wise last year. Had 80 catches, 1,297 yards, almost 1,300 yards in the air, 8 touchdowns, man. And this was the offense that needed him. Like when he was down, we would see Noah Brown step up or we would see Tank Dell step up. But it's like this offense needed Nico Collins, and he played extremely well. So the only caveat to this receiving core now is that Stefon Diggs is here. And Tank Dell will be back healthy. But with Diggs here, there's truly going to be a 1A, 1B type scenario. And we don't really know who the alpha is quite yet. We can assume based on pedigree, we can assume based on previous production, but I think CJ Stroud spreads the ball around. So it wouldn't surprise me if we see multiple 1,000-yard receivers in this offense this season. Nico Collins, I think he's more wide receiver 2 in this offense. I think Diggs overtakes as the wide receiver 1. I think that's the reason you make a move for a guy like that. But Nico Collins should still be very fantasy relevant. I think he had the better year last year. I don't think we see anything close to 80 catches, 1,300 yards, 8 touchdowns again this season. And if we did, that means CJ Stroud broke out in a way that we didn't see coming, or maybe y'all saw coming, but I personally didn't see coming. So I think Nico Collins is set to have a very similar year to last year. I would just expect a little bit of regression when it comes to overall numbers because the competition for targets is crazy now, especially with Stefon Diggs in the fold. So Stefon Diggs, man, the wide receiver 9 last year, and for everybody that's kind of been like playing on Stefon Diggs and saying, oh, he hasn't been playing as well. He's on, the downside of his career. Like he had a strong season last year. Are we watching the same game? Like, yes, I know towards the end of the season, he didn't play as well. But if you account for the entire season, Diggs had 107 catches, 1,183 yards, 8 touchdowns. Like, I mean, maybe towards the end of the year, we weren't getting elite production out of Stefon Diggs, and we knew that he was kind of like, he was unhappy there. But, like, we still had a top 10 receiver last year, and I think Diggs is going to go really late in drafts. A lot of people are going to pass on him and draft Nico Collins instead. Diggs restructured his contract. He had 3 years left on his deal, consolidated all down to 1. He will be a free agent at the end of this season. He's trying to get paid. This is a player who has a lot to play for and probably the last big contract of his career. I think Diggs goes crazy this year in this offense, and I think he's the number one receiver in this offense. So I think when it comes to Diggs, if we're looking at like a 1,300-yard season, 100 catches, that's not out of the realm of possibilities for a big-time player like Diggs, who has a lot to prove this season. Y'all, I know this is going to be a debate all offseason. Is it Diggs or is it Nico Collins? I'm flag planting right now. Right now. Stefon Diggs is going to be the wide receiver one on this team. Nico Collins is going to be the number two. That's my flag plant on this Houston Texans offensive receiving core. I think we see more Diggs, a little bit less Nico. Both of them are productive. If you want to call it 1A, 1B, that's fine. But reminiscence of like two really good receivers in the offense, your Jamar Chase, T. Higgins, your Devontae Smith, A.J. Brown. That's what this is for this Texans offense. All right. Some weeks I'd expect Collins to be better. Some weeks I expect Diggs to be better. All right. That's how I see it. All right. And then we got to talk about Tank Dell as well. So Tank Dell broke his fibula towards the end of last season. Also had a minor gun wound this offseason. Like, you know, Tank Dell, and this is a guy that CJ Stroud really, really likes. They did a pick any 11 players on offense, and Tank Dell was his slot guy. Like, that was one of his players. So CJ Stroud handpicked him for the draft, and then handpicked him even on his you take any player in the league, and he was one of his guys. So he's a favorite of CJ Stroud. And last year before his injury, he had 709 yards, 7 TDs. And I mean, he was on a points per game basis, he was a wide receiver too. You know what I mean? He was the number 19 receiver in all of fantasy last year on a points per game basis. So the problem is now you bring in another alpha receiver. You bring in Stefon Diggs, who, I mean, he's going to command a big portion of the targets that are available in this offense. It's just the kind of player that Diggs is. I don't think he's expecting to go into a contract year and be a complementary piece in this offense, where I feel like Tank Dell is already kind of a complementary player. He's going to have some opportunities downfield to win downfield like he did in his rookie season. And he obviously still has a connection with CJ Stroud, which we know that's a strong connection. He's going to have an impact on the offense. I just think it's going to be more wide receiver 3, flex worthy, depending on your league size. It's going to be more flex worthy any given week, and it's going to be tough to consistently depend on his production. So while I like Tank Dell, I think he's a secondary piece in this offense. Maybe next year if Diggs if he leaves, now we have more upside with Tank Dell. So for your dynasty players, maybe you're holding on to him because obviously the connection's real with him and CJ Stroud. But when it comes to this season, redraft, coming off the injury, I think we got to temper expectations for Tank Dell and what we're going to see for him this year. He's going to be more flex territory. Don't think of last year's numbers, especially with Diggs and Joe Mixon and other hands coming into the fold. All right. So we got to pump the brakes a little bit on Tank Dell. I know we love the name and where he came out of last year. Just kind of came from nowhere. We got to pump the brakes. And then lastly, we got to talk Dalton Schultz, who did re-sign with the Houston Texans this offseason. He was the tight end 10 last year, played a real pivotal role, especially when the receivers were banged up for this Texans team. 59 catches, 635 yards, 5 touchdowns. And like I said, when there was a few injuries on this team, he had a really nice stretch from week 4 to week 11 when CJ Stroud was heating up. So with Diggs in, with Tank Dell coming back, with Joe Mixon healthy, I think Dalton Schultz will be a nice tight end one to have. He'll be inconsistent. But will he have some big games? Yes. He's going to be a part of this offense? Yes. So he has a role. He signed. I think we can comfortably say Dalton Schultz will have some kind of role in this offense. It remains to be seen with that exact how much they're able to use him on a week-to-week basis. I think that's where we're going to see the inconsistencies. Have some stronger games, 75 yards, touchdown. Then he's going to have some duds with 3 catches for 30 yards. You got to eat that if you have him at your tight end spot. And just know he's not going to be the same type of tight end that he was last year. High-end tight end 2, back-end tight end 1 is where I got Dalton Schultz value at. All right, hopefully y'all got some good info out of that. Let me know if you guys agree, disagree, or if there's any other players that we did not discuss. Until then, I'll see you on the next one. Peace out.